A case of hypnotic cure. Sigmund Freud. A case of hypnotic cure. And some observations on the genesis of hysterical symptoms by contrary will. I decide to publish here the story of a healing obtained through hypnotic suggestion because it is a case to which a series of accessory circumstances of greater transparency and probative force than those usually involved in most of our therapeutic results of this order. The woman whom I was given to help in this way, at a very important moment in her existence, had been known to me for many years, and for several years she remained subject to my observation. The disturbance from which the hypnotic suggestion freed her had already arisen once before, being ineffectively combated and imposing a painful resignation on the subject, which the second time I managed to avoid with my help. Still, a year later, the said disturbance reappeared for the third time, to be suppressed again with the same means, but now in a definitive way, not returning to torment the subject throughout the time she had to exercise the function on which it fell. In addition, I think I have managed in this case to discover the simple mechanism of the disturbance and to relate it to analogous processes in the field of neuropathology. In order not to continue speaking in riddles, we are dealing with a case in which a mother found herself unable to breastfeed her newborn child until the intervention of hypnotic suggestion, and in which what happened after a previous and a subsequent delivery allowed a verification, only rarely possible, of the therapeutic result. The subject of the case history below is a woman. Young man, between the ages of 20 and 30, whom I happen to know from her childhood years, and who, due to her excellent qualities, her serene reflection and her naturalness, had never given, nor to her family doctor, an impression of nervousness. Taking into account the events that I propose to relate below, we must consider it, following Charcot's felicitous expression, as a category hysteric occasion perfectly compatible with the best qualities and intact nervous health in every other point. From her family I know her mother, a woman who is not nervous, and a younger sister, very similar to her and perfectly healthy. Instead, a brother of his suffered from juvenile neurasthenia, which ruined all his plans for the future. The etiology and course of this disease, the development of which I have repeatedly observed every year, always very similar, are well known to me. The good primitive constitution of the subject perished assailed by the current pubertal sexual difficulties, the excessive work of the years of studies and its intensification when the final exam arrived, a gonorrhea and, linked to it, the sudden explosion of a dyspepsia, accompanied by tenacious constipation, of almost incredible intensity, which months later disappeared, being replaced by a heavy head, bad mood, and inability to work. From this moment on, an alteration of the character of the subject developed, which made him a constant torment for his family. It is not possible for me to say at this time whether this form of neurasthenia can be fully acquired or not. So, then, and bearing in mind, moreover, that I do not know the other relatives of my patient, I will leave undecided the question of whether we are to suppose in her family a hereditary disposition to neuroses. At the birth of her first child, she had had the patient intention of raising him without any outside help. Delivery was no more difficult than usual for gilts, ending with a light application of forceps. But the mother did not achieve, despite her excellent physical constitution, her illusion of being a good nurse. She had little milk, she felt intense pain when she breastfed the child. She lost her appetite, became repugnant to food, and spent her nights sleepless and excited. In this way, and in order not to seriously endanger the child's health and his own, it was necessary to declare the attempt unsuccessful, after 14 days, and look for a nurse, immediately disappearing all the mother's inconveniences. I will make it clear that I cannot report on this first attempt to breastfeed as a doctor or as a witness. 3 years later the subject had her second child, and also due to external circumstances it was desirable to avoid breastfeeding. Mercenary. But the mother's efforts in this direction seemed to be even less successful and to cause more painful phenomena than the first time. The young mother vomited all food, did not sleep and was so depressed by her inability that the two family physicians, the accredited doctors Brewer and Lott, opposed any continuation of the attempt, advising hypnotic suggestion as the last experiential means. Thus, on the fourth day, in the afternoon, I was called to the bedside of the sick woman. Upon my arrival, I found her in bed, her cheeks very flushed and furious at her inability to raise the child, incapacity that grew with each new attempt, despite putting all her effort to control it. To avoid vomiting, he had not eaten all that day. The epigastrium appeared bulging, and placing the hand on the stomach, continuous contractions were noted. The patient also complained of a constant bad taste in her mouth. Neither she nor her relatives received me as a person from whom help was expected, but only in obedience to what was indicated by the other doctors. I could not, therefore, count on great confidence on his part. Immediately I tried to produce hypnosis, making the patient fix her eyes on mine and suggesting to her the symptoms of the dream. 3 minutes later, the patient was lying on her bed, with the calm expression of deep repose, then making use of the suggestion to contradict all her fears and all the sensations on which said fears were based. "Don't be afraid, you will be an excellent nurse and the child will grow up wonderfully. His stomach is doing very well, you have a great appetite and are looking forward to eating, etc." The sick woman continued to sleep when I left her for a few moments, and when she woke up she showed total amnesia regarding what had happened during hypnosis. Before I left, I still had to reject a remark from the husband about the danger that hypnosis would forever disturb his wife's nerves. The facts that the relatives of the patient reported to me the following day, to whom they did not seem to have made any impression, constituted for me a guarantee of success. The subject had dined without the slightest disturbance, had slept well and had breakfast, in the morning, with great appetite. In all this time she had nursed her child without the slightest difficulty. But at the sight of the lunch, too copious, his repugnance awoke again, and before he had tasted anything, the vomiting reappeared. From this moment it was impossible for her to breastfeed the child again, and when I arrived she showed the same symptoms as the day before. My argument that I had no what to worry about, once it was verified that his discomfort could disappear and had, in fact, disappeared for almost half a day, it had no effect. So, turning again to hypnosis, I developed more energy than the day before, suggesting that 5 minutes after my departure, she had to meet her family, somewhat violently, and ask them why they did not give her dinner, if they had proposed to starve her to death, if they believed that in this way she would be able to raise her child, etc. On my third visit I no longer needed the subject of any treatment. He lacked nothing now, she had a good appetite, she had enough milk for the child, it caused her no pain to breastfeed, etc. Her husband had been disturbed that after my departure she had leveled harsh reproaches at her mother, contrary to her general custom. But since then everything was fine. My speech ended here around this time. The subject. She breastfed her son for 8 months, and I had the opportunity to verify the good health of both of them several times during this period. I only had to find it incomprehensible and irritating that no one in the family ever told me again about the good result obtained with my intervention. But a year later I got my revenge. A third child. He raised the problem again, presenting himself again the impossibility of raising him. I found the subject in the same state as the previous time, indignant against herself to see that all her willpower failed to overcome the reluctance to eat and the other symptoms. The first hypnosis session did not produce any other result than to make the patient feel hopeless. But after the second the symptom complex was again so completely annulled that there was no need for more. The subject also raised this child, who is now a year and a half old, without any discomfort, and is in good health. Faced with this repetition of therapeutic success, the couple changed their attitude towards me, and they confessed to me the reason why. Obeyed. I was ashamed, said the woman, to admit that hypnotism achieved what all my willpower was not enough to achieve. In any case, I don't think either she or her husband have overcome their aversion to hypnosis. We now go on to explain the psychic mechanism of our patient's disturbance, suppressed by suggestion. As in other cases, of which I will discuss later, I did not have direct news of said mechanism, but rather I had to guess it. There are representations with which an expectant affect is linked, and they are of two orders: representations that we will do this or that is, purposes, and representations that something determined will happen to us, that is, expectations. The affection attached to them depends on two factors: first, the importance that the event may have for us, and secondly, the degree of insecurity that the expectation of it entails. Subjective insecurity. Counter-expectation is represented by a series of representations which we call painful contrasting representations. When it comes to a purpose, these contrasting representations are that we will not be able to carry it out because we oppose such or such difficulties, lack the necessary qualities to achieve success, and know that certain other people have failed in similar circumstances. The other case, that of expectation, does not require any clarification. The counter-expectation rests on the reflection of all the possibilities with that we may stumble instead of the desired. Continuing the discussion of this case, we would come to the phobias that play such a large role in symptomatology of neuroses. For now we will remain in the first category, that is, in the purposes. We will have to ask ourselves, first of all, what is the fate of contrasting representations in normal mental life? In our opinion, they are inhibited, alibi and excluded from the association, sometimes to such an extent, that their existence is almost never made evident, compared to the purpose, being only the study of neuroses the one that reveals them to us. On the other hand, in neuroses, and I am not referring only to hysteria, but to the status nervosus in general, there is, primarily, a tendency to mental depression and decreased awareness of one's own self, just as we find it, as an isolated and highly developed symptom, in melancholy. In neurosis, contrasting representations with the purpose are also of great importance, because their content adapts very well to the state of mind proper to this affection, or perhaps because neurosis gives rise to representations of this order, which without it cannot exist. They would have been constituted. This intensification of contrasting representations is shown to us, in the simple status nervosus, and referred to the expectation, as a general pessimistic tendency, and in occasional neurasthenia, by association with the most causal sensations, to the multiple phobias of neurasthenics. Transferred to purposes, this factor creates those disturbances that can be brought together under the name of folie de doute, and whose content is the distrust of the subject with respect to his own performance. It is precisely at this point that the two great neuroses, neurasthenia and hysteria, behave in a completely different and characteristic way for each of them. In neurasthenia, the pathologically intensified contrasting representation unites with the representation of the positive will to form a single act of consciousness, and withdrawing from it gives rise to that lack of will of neurasthenics, from which they realize perfect account these patients. In hysteria, the process differs from it in 2 points, or perhaps in only one. As corresponds to the tendency of hysteria to dissociate consciousness, the painful contrasting representation, apparently alibi, is dissociated from the purpose and persists, unconscious for the patient, as an isolated representation. Characteristic of hysteria is the fact that this alibi representation is then objectified, by somatic innervation, when the time comes to carry out the purpose, with the same ease and in the same way as in the normal state the representation of positive abolition. The contrasting representation is constituted, so to speak, in an opposite will, and the patient realizes with astonishment that all his positive will remains impotent. Such two factors merge, perhaps, into a single one, as we have already indicated, most likely happening that if the contrasting representation finds a way to objectify itself, it is because it is not limited by her link with the purpose in the same way that she abridges it. In our case, of a mother who, due to a nervous disturbance, prevents her from breastfeeding her child, a neurasthenic would have behaved in the following way: she would have felt grave fears in the face of the maternal task that was posed to her and given endless thought to all accidents and possible dangers, ending, without. However, for raising her son perfectly, though tormented by constant doubts and fears, unless the contrasting representation was victorious, in which case the subject would have abandoned her purpose, finding herself incapable of carrying it out. The hysteric behaves very differently. Perhaps he is not aware of his fears, he harbors the firm intention of carrying out his purpose and embarks, without any hesitation, on the path to achieve it. But from this moment on, she behaves as if she harbored the firm will not to breastfeed the child, and this will provokes in her all those subjective symptoms that a simulant would try to experience in order to avoid fulfilling her maternal obligations, that is, lack of appetite, the repugnance to all food, and the impossibility of breastfeeding the child because of the terrible pain that this caused him. But, furthermore, since the contrary will is superior to conscious simulation, as far as control of the body is concerned, the hysteric will present a whole series of objective symptoms that simulation fails to bring out. In contrast to the lack of will of the neurasthenia, there is a perversion of the will here, and instead of the resigned indecision of the neurasthenic, she shows the hysterical astonishment and indignation at the duality incomprehensible to her. I therefore believe it justified to consider my patient as a hysteric de occasion, given that under the influence of a motive, occasionally he was able to produce a complex of symptoms, so exquisitely hysterical in mechanism. As an occasional cause we can consider here the excitement before the first childbirth or the exhaustion that follows, since the first childbirth constitutes the greatest commotion that the female organism can experience, shock after which the woman usually produces all those neurotic symptoms to which she is predisposed. The case of my patient is probably typical of a wide series of others in which lactation or some other analogous function is disturbed by nervous influences, and its nature becomes clear to us. But since the corresponding psychic mechanism was not revealed to me directly in it, but I arrived at it by speculative induction, I hasten to assure you that the investigation of patients under hypnosis has often revealed to me the existence of a similar psychic mechanism of the hysterical phenomena. I will present here one of the most singular examples of this order. Years ago I had a hysterical lady undergoing treatment, with a very energetic will for everything that was not related to her illness, but seriously affected, on the other hand, by numerous and tyrannical incapacities and hysterical prohibitions. Among other symptoms, he presented that of producing from time to time, in the manner of a tick, an inarticulate sound, a singular clicking or chattering, which made its way between his contracted lips. After several weeks I asked, on what occasion had that symptom first appeared? The answer was, I don't know. A long time ago. Thus I was already inclined to regard it as a genuine tic, when one day it occurred to me to question the patient again, while she was in a deep hypnotic sleep. In hypnosis, this patient arranged, without the need for suggestion none, of his entire store of memories or, as I am very inclined to say, of the entire range of his consciousness, restricted during the waking state. To my question as to when the symptom had first occurred, he immediately replied, I have had it ever since I was watching over my youngest daughter, who was seriously ill, and I decided to keep the most absolute silence so as not to disturb the situation. Sleep that he had finally reconciled, after a day of continuous convulsions. Then he disappeared and didn't bother me again until many years later, after the event I'm going to tell you about. Driving with my daughters through a forest, we were surprised by a storm, and the horses were spooked when lightning struck a nearby tree. Then I thought that I should avoid all noise so as not to scare the horses any more, but against all my will produced the click that since then it is impossible for me to repress. Having referred in this way the singular click to his source of origin, disappeared completely and for many years, thus convincing me that it was not a real tic. This was the first occasion that offered me to verify the genesis of a hysterical symptom by objectifying the painful contrasting representation, or B by opposite will. The mother, exhausted by the fear and worries caused by her daughter's illness, intends to keep the most absolute silence so as not to disturb the patient's long-awaited rest. But being in a state of great exhaustion, the contrasting representation that he would end up making some noise proves to be the strongest. It manages to give rise to an innervation of the tongue, an innervation that the purpose of remaining silent had, perhaps, forgotten to prevent. Breaks the contraction of the lips and produces a noise, which acquires a fixed character from this moment on, especially after the repetition of the same event. To arrive at a full understanding of this process we still have to attend to a certain objection. Indeed, we may be asked how, given a general exhaustion which establishes, of course, the disposition to such a process precisely, the contrasting representation wins. Our answer would be that such exhaustion is not only partial. Those elements of the nervous system that constitute the material foundations of the representations associated with primary consciousness are exhausted. Instead, the representations excluded from this chain of associations of the normal ego are not exhausted, and thus predominate at the moment of the hysterical disposition. Now, every connoisseur of hysteria will observe that the psychic mechanism described here clarifies not only some isolated hysterical accidents, but also broad sections of the symptom picture of hysteria and one of its most singular characteristic features. Our assertion that it was the contrasting representations that were painful, restricted and rejected by normal consciousness were the ones that came to the fore and found their way to somatic innervation at the moment of the hysterical disposition, also gives us the key to the peculiarity of delusions accompanying hysterical attacks. It is no accident that the hysterical delusions of the nuns, in the epidemics of the Middle Ages, consisted of serious blasphemies and unbridled eroticism, nor that precisely the best educated and most formal children are the ones who in their hysterical attacks show themselves to be the most rude, insolent, and crafty. The series of representations laboriously repressed are those that remain in these cases converted into acts, as a result of a kind of contrary will, when the person succumbs to hysterical exhaustion. This relationship is here closer than ever, since it is precisely this laborious repression that causes the aforementioned hysterical state, in whose description psychology we have not entered, for limiting ourselves in the present work to the explanation of why given previously such a state of hysterical disposition the symptoms appear in the way we observe them. Hysteria owes to this emergence of the contrary will that demonic character that it so often presents and that manifests itself in the fact that patients are unable, on certain occasions, to do what they most ardently desire. They do precisely the opposite of what they are told. They have asked for and they slander what is most dear to them or they distrust it. The perversion of character, typical of the hysteric, momentum to do evil or to get sick when he most desires health, constitutes a coercion to which the most blameless characters succumb when they are abandoned for some time to the action of contrasting representations. The question concerning the fate of inhibited purposes seems meaningless as far as normal intellectual life is concerned. It could be answered by saying that they do not come to exist. But the study of hysteria shows that, on the contrary, they come to life, that is, that the material modification corresponding to them. It remains preserved, surviving such purposes, like phantoms of a dark realm, until the moment when they manage to emerge and seize the body that until then would have faithfully served the consciousness of the self. I have said before that this mechanism is typical of hysteria. And I must now add that it is not exclusive to this condition. We find it again in the convulsive tic, a neurosis with such a great symptomatic analogy with hysteria that its entire symptom picture can appear as a partial phenomenon of it, thus resulting that Charcot, after careful study, could only establish, as difference, that the hysterical tic eventually disappears, while the authentic tic persists. The picture of a severe convulsive tic is made up of involuntary movements that frequently, always, according to Charcot and Guénon, present the character of gestures or movements appropriate on some previous occasion, coprolalia, echolalia and obsessive representations, of those corresponding to the folie d'étude. However, it is surprising to read in Guénon, an author who did not penetrate into the psychic mechanism of these symptoms, the affirmation that some of his patients had arrived at their gestures and contractions through the objectification of the contrasting representation. Such patients indicate that they have seen on a certain occasion an analogous tic or a comedian, who intentionally contracted his face in this way, having then felt the fear of being forced to imitate such ugly and ridiculous contractions. And, indeed, from that moment they had begun to imitate them. Actually, only a very small part of the involuntary movements arises in this way in the ticket holders. Instead, we are inclined to ascribe this mechanism to coprolalia, the name we give to the irrepressible impulse that compels ticket holders, against all their will, to utter the rudest words. The root of coprolalia would be the patient's perception that it is impossible for him to stop making certain sounds. This perception would then be linked to the fear of losing control over other sounds, especially over those words that well-educated men avoid pronouncing, and this fear would lead them to carry out what they feared. I can't find any anamnesis in Guénon that confirms this hypothesis, and, for my part, I have not had the opportunity to question any patient with coprolalia. On the other hand, I find in the same author the presentation of another case of tic, in which the words involuntarily pronounced did not belong to the terminology of coprolalia. The subject of this case was an adult man, who was forced to constantly pronounce the name of Maria. As a student, he had fallen in love with a girl of that name, an infatuation that absorbed him for a long time and predisposed him to neurosis. By then he began to pronounce out loud during class hours the name of his beloved, and this name became a tic that lasted even more than 20 years, after the subject's infatuation ceased. In my opinion, what happened in this case was that the firm desire of the subject to keep the name of his beloved hidden was transformed, when a moment of special excitement arrived, into the opposite will, and the tic has persisted ever since. In the case of my second patient, if the explanation of this example is exact, we will have to attribute the same mechanism to the proper coprolalic tic, since the rude words are secrets that we all know and whose knowledge we always try to hide from each other. End. A case of hypnotic cure. Sigmund Freud.